There's something unsettling about the highway at night. A single ribbon of pavement slicing through the void, the hum of tires against asphalt, the rhythmic flash of painted lines slipping away into darkness. The only signs of life are the distant glow of gas stations at the bottom of an on-ramp, or the brief glare of headlights from oncoming traffic. You can spend hours, even days, on the road, thinking only of where you've been or where you're going, all without ever really thinking about where you are. Just the slow, creeping sense that you are hurtling through nowhere. But in 1988, if you had glanced out your window at a late-night stretch of Route 140 or Interstate 195 in Massachusetts, you might have felt alone, but you weren't. In less than 2 years, 11 women vanished. 9 were found discarded along the roadside, bodies left just beyond the shoulder, barely hidden by the overgrowth. 2 were never found at all. Some believe that this was just another predator hunting at the edge of darkness. Others believe this was a member of the cult from nearby Fall River, those who murdered in the name of the devil. The police began to call him the New Bedford Highway Killer, and it's all he was ever known as, because he was never caught. I want to share an idea with you that keeps me awake at night. Maybe it's not about one man. Maybe it never was. Maybe it's a reflection of the world that man lives in. A recurring distortion, echoing through generations. This killer, all killers, they are a vessel, a momentary form for some deeper malignancy that chooses to step into this world. It's not a man, it's a mechanism that allows a killer to emerge and vanish without consequence. The highway killer, whether he died, whether he disappeared, the mechanism remains intact, dormant, coiled beneath the surface of society, waiting to wear another man like a skin suit, waiting to pick up where things left off. We must carry something in us, and that something must be reflected in the worlds we build. That is why this story never ends. It's only waiting to start again. On the edges of towns too tired to care, in the cracks of systems too broken to fix. A different woman, a different man, a different city. When the moment is right, it will start again. It is an inevitability. It is a consequence of who we are. There will be those who will be forgotten, and there will be those who forget. And if there's any hope for justice, there will be a select few who spend their whole lives trying to be neither. It began in the spring of 1988 with the quiet vanishing of Robin Lynn Rhodes. Her mother diligently reported her missing, but authorities dismissed the case. It was buried beneath the weight of her circumstances. Rhodes was a 29-year-old mother, stranded between survival and addiction. Her mother described her as a loner with a drug problem, but a caring soul. Someone who had love in her heart, but was slowly losing herself to heroin and cocaine. She struggled for years, slipping in and out of places where people go when they have nowhere else left. One of those places was Weld Square in New Bedford. By the mid-1980s, organized crime from New York had sunk their teeth into New Bedford, transforming Weld Square into a corridor of desperation and dependency. It was the perfect location due to its proximity to Interstate 195 and Route 140. People came from as far as New Hampshire, and over time it became known as the Red Light District of New Bedford, where drugs and sex work happened in plain sight. Horrifyingly, nearly all the victims of the New Bedford Highway Killer frequented Weld Square many chasing drugs, soliciting Johns, or both. The area was nearly perfect for a predator. Under the veil of so much criminality, he could operate with impunity, slowly cruise the blocks, window shopping for a perfect victim, one whose disappearance would be dismissed as typical for someone battling addiction or working the streets. No one is certain the exact day Rhodes disappeared, not even her boyfriend, Frankie Pina. Their volatile relationship is likely another reason this case was initially dismissed by investigators. Pina was a local drug dealer who had previous domestic violence reports with Rhodes. Their friends described their relationship as unstable, yet after she disappeared, Pina pushed for answers. He begged police to take the case seriously, but no one listened. For nearly a year, Rhodes was just another name, slowly eroding through time. And then in March 1989, a search dog led investigators to something off the shoulder of Route 140 in Freetown, a body. She had been there for nearly a year, left just beyond the tree line where the headlights couldn't catch her. The body was badly decomposed, complicating immediate identification. It wasn't until nearly a year after her disappearance that she was identified via dental records. By that time, she was the seventh to be connected to the New Bedford Highway Killer. Bizarrely, Rhodes knew other victims, and several suspects later connected to the case. Connections that will be explored later. Her disappearance was only the first shadow of something far darker. When Rochelle Dopiarala disappeared in late April 1988, her life had already been unraveling for years. Addiction had taken root early, beginning in her teens and escalating quickly from cannabis to heroin. It took everything from her. Her family, even her children, watched her collapse from within, like a dilapidated house. She moved between homes in Cape Cod and New Bedford, relying on acquaintances, burning bridges as she sank deeper into addiction. Unlike most of the other victims, she wasn't part of the Weld Square scene. Not exactly. She stayed near South First Street, but the consequences were the same. Like so many others, she had become invisible long before she was gone, and she wasn't alone. Her life intersected with others who would soon be consumed by the same darkness. She was close with Nancy Paiva, another woman who would soon be found along the highway. They roomed together, stashed their belongings together, and tried to survive together. And then there was Kenneth Ponte, a New Bedford attorney with a long history of drug use, solicitation, and violence. Ponte gravitated toward women like Dopiarala. In April 1988, just days before her disappearance, a strange and unsettling series of events unfolded. Roger Swire and his girlfriend were sitting in their car when they saw Ponte and Dopiarala nearby around 3 p.m. Within seconds, Ponte was outside Swire's window, accusing him of assaulting Dopiarala. Swire denied the accusation, but Ponte didn't care. Ponte flashed a deputy sheriff's badge before pulling a pistol, pressing it inches from Swire's chest. He would later tell investigators that he saw Ponte and Dopiarala together as many as 6 times a day. After the incident, Dopiarala's mother pursued a court-ordered mandate requiring her to enter detox in Quincy. The order was meant to save her, but she had no intention of staying. Days later, she called her mother to say she was leaving. Her mother reported the violation to the police, hoping the consequences would drive her daughter to sobriety. But Dopiarala never showed up at the welfare office in Falmouth. She missed her court date on April 21st. She was gone. A local drug dealer claimed he saw Ponte screaming at her on Purchase Street, threatening to kill her. She fled the scene on foot. A few days later, on April 27th, Detective John Dextrador saw Dopiarala walking with Nancy Paiva and Frankie Pina, the same man who had been involved with Robin Rose. She told them she was afraid of Ponte. It was the last time Dopiarala was seen alive. On December 10th, 1988, 2 hunters on ATVs stumbled across her body partially clothed and left in a gravel pit beneath a grove of trees near Reed Road in Dartmouth. Unlike the others, she wasn't left at the roadside. She had been hidden away nearly 2 miles from Interstate 195. Her cause of death wasn't strangulation, it was blunt force trauma. The setting was different, the disposal was different. Her name would resurface as investigators pieced together links between the victims, as they began to scrutinize men like Frankie Pina and Kenneth Ponte, trying to understand how this spiral of disappearances had unfolded. She was only the second to disappear, but her body would be the 6th recovered. A body in the gravel, a name on a case file, and a list of questions that could only fail to fill the silence. It was late on the night of May 27, 1988, when Deborah Ann Medeiros got into an argument with her boyfriend at his home in New Bedford. No one remembers what it was about, but at some point she made a decision. She left in the middle of the night. Her bags were still packed by the door, ready for a trip she would never take. She had just received a $2,000 settlement from a work-related foot injury, money she planned to cash before leaving on a cruise with her boyfriend and friends, but she never made it. A month passed before her mother reported her missing, and by then it was already too late. Medeiros was 29. She was born and raised in Fall River, the youngest of 3 siblings. She loved to read. She lived with her mother, but her heroin addiction kept her away for long stretches. In 1986, she was sentenced to 90 days in Framingham for possession of a needle and syringe. The judge gave her 3 years of probation, hoping she would use it to turn her life around. She tried. She earned her GED while incarcerated. When she was free, she worked a number of factory jobs, trying to rebuild her life. But the charges returned: check fraud, possession, armed robbery. Her mother believed she had beaten her addiction, and so did her boyfriend, but others weren't so sure. Her defense attorney, who had helped her through previous drug cases, saw her in March 1988, helping her get treatment for blood poisoning. He remembered her well. Everyone tried to straighten her out, but she just wouldn't listen. On July 3, 1988, Sandy Lehner pulled onto the shoulder of Route 140 in Freetown, just south of the Lakeville town line. She needed to walk her dog, a Pekingese. She saw something at the bottom of a nearby slope, a body. Later, the cause of death was determined to be strangulation. Her mother had reported her missing, but it took investigators another 5 months to identify the body of Deborah Medeiros. She was from Fall River, and they had been looking for missing women from New Bedford. Medeiros was the first body to be discovered, and unknowingly, her death marked the beginning. By December, investigators were actively scouring the highways with cadaver dogs. One by one, more bodies were found, and as detectives began drawing lines between the women, strange connections began to form. Medeiros had known Dawn Mendez, another woman who would soon be found. She had lived just blocks from 2 other victims from Fall River. The pattern was already emerging, and the New Bedford Highway Killer was only just beginning. By the time her family realized Deborah Lynn McConnell was missing, she had already been dead for months. Her father, James McConnell, a former Navy cook, had raised her near the naval base in Newport, Rhode Island. At some point, her life began to unravel in a way that felt inevitable, a slow descent into addiction that pulled her further and further each year. She began living on the streets at just 14, chasing heroin and cocaine. She accumulated a police record across Rhode Island and Massachusetts. In 1987, she was arrested twice for prostitution in Weld Square. That same year, she was caught with a syringe, and in August 1987, she was sentenced to 6 months in jail. She only served 15 days. Her last known sighting came in April 1988 at her mother's funeral in Rhode Island. By May, her 10-year-old daughter's birthday came and went. McConnell never showed. Her father wasn't surprised. He had been watching her disappear for years, but Now the newspapers were different. Bodies were being found along the highways. A pattern was forming, and her boyfriend called him, afraid that McConnell may be among them. James McConnell tried to report her missing. No one listened. The state police dismissed the report because he said I-95 instead of I-195. The New Bedford police didn't return his calls. Days passed, then weeks. Then it was too late. On December 1st, 1988, investigators combed the northbound stretch of Route 140 near Freetown. A cadaver dog led them into the brush near the Brayley Road exit. They found a body, partially clothed, jeans pulled to mid-thigh, upper body exposed. The same haunting pattern. At first, no one knew her name. It wasn't until McConnell heard a televised description of the remains that they contacted authorities. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Roger Ubelaker confirmed her identity using X-ray records. She was the fourth woman to disappear and the fifth body to be discovered. Bizarrely, her life intersected with other victims. She had worked as a bartender at the Town Tavern in June 1987, a bar owned by the same company as the Quarterdeck Lounge, where future victim Mary Rose Santos worked. She had known Nancy Paiva, and through her, she knew Rochelle Dopiarala. The web was expanding, the body count was rising, and more women were waiting to be found. On June 18, 1988, Deborah Greenlaw DeMillo walked away from her work release job at a supply company in Providence, Rhode Island. She never returned. She had been serving time at the Adult Correctional Institution in Cranston, the result of years spent circling through drug-related arrests, prostitution charges, and parole violations. While incarcerated, she earned her GED, and she believed early release was within reach. But when her parole was delayed, she made a choice. She refused to go back. Authorities listed her as an escapee, but even then, no one came looking. She was just another woman falling through the cracks of a system that was used to letting people disappear. Born in Brockton, Massachusetts, she was raised by her mother, Madeline Perry. She began using drugs at just 14, and by 22, she was married to a man she met at a methadone clinic. They built a life in Acushnet, trying to escape her past, but it didn't last. The marriage ended in divorce, and she found herself right back in the place she fought to escape. By the late 1980s, she had 3 children, a 15-year-old daughter and 2 sons, ages 8 and 3, but she was barely surviving herself. She entered treatment programs. She relapsed. In 1987, she was arrested and charged with loitering for prostitution in Providence. She received a 21-month sentence. Eventually, she was granted work release, employed at a supply company, attempting to prove she was stable and employable. But when parole was delayed, she ran. In the summer of 1988, she resurfaced in New Bedford, crashing on couches, and on August 2nd, an old boyfriend saw her near Weld Square. That was the last confirmed sighting. 4 months passed. On November 8, 1988, a state highway worker was clearing brush off the eastbound Reed Road exit ramp on Interstate 195 in Dartmouth. They found her hidden in the overgrowth. Her body had been left to the elements. 4 months of heat, rain, and wind had reduced her to bones. Scattered clothing and jewelry were recovered nearby, but none of it belonged to her. Those items belonged to the next victim, Nancy Paiva. At first, police struggled to identify the remains. It wasn't until an anonymous caller provided her description and name, reporting that she had spent time incarcerated in Rhode Island. After fetching her prison records, they matched dental x-rays and achieved a positive identification. DeMillo had been missing for nearly 5 months. Her family had long feared the worst. They had been unable to report her as missing because of her status as an escaped prisoner, and whoever had taken her was still out there, moving like a virus through the veins of the interstate, a sickness that was still spreading. Nancy Lee Paiva was last seen on July 7, 1988, walking home from from Whispers Bar in New Bedford's South End after a fight with her boyfriend, Frankie Pina. She was 36, a mother of 2, a survivor. But that night she was alone. A neighbor saw her and offered her a ride. She refused, and that was the last time anyone saw her alive. Nancy Paiva hadn't always been lost. She was outgoing, ambitious, taking college courses in high school, attending secretarial school, and later, training as a certified nursing assistant. She worked wherever she could, a string of jobs, a key punch operator, a video store manager, a night supervisor at a nursing home. At the same time of her disappearance, she was working 2 jobs, one at an ice cream shop, another as a security guard. But the cracks had been forming. 3 years earlier, both her parents died suddenly. The grief hit her like a wave and never stopped pulling. And into that grief, heroin was introduced by Frankie Pina. Pina's name has surfaced before. He was controlling, violent. Police were called to their Morgan Street apartment numerous times for domestic disturbances. Horrifyingly, her 2 teenage daughters would physically fight him to stop his assault on their mother. He controlled everything: her money, her food stamps, her freedom. Desperate to reclaim her life, she tried to get clean, attending a rehabilitation program in November 1987. Pina convinced her to leave, pulling her deeper into her addiction. By then, she was shooting up in front of her children. Eventually, she lost custody. Her family begged her to leave him, but she always went back. Then, one night in July, she didn't come back at all. Frankie Pina shocked everyone by reporting Paiva missing the following day. Later, her sister followed with her own missing persons report, but by then it was too late. On July 30th, 1988, a passing motorist pulled onto the shoulder of westbound I-195 near the Reed Road exit in Dartmouth, looking for a place to relieve himself. That's when he saw the body, unclothed, decomposing, lying on its back in the woods, legs spread, feet facing the highway. There were no possessions nearby, no clothing, nothing to her name. As investigators later discovered, Nancy's clothing had been left near the body of Deborah DeMello, an apparent attempt to confuse, to taunt, to delay identification, and it worked. It wasn't until December 6, 1988 that Nancy Paiva was identified via dental records. Her daughters confirmed the items left near DeMello belonged to their mother. The connections were growing clearer. Just 3 months before she vanished, Nancy had shared her home with another woman, sᴜᴘᴘᴏᴛ. They lived together for a time, both trapped in the same cycle of addiction, abuse, and survival. And then sᴜᴘᴘᴏᴛ vanished. Now, Nancy had followed her. Same killer, same pattern, and he was still out there. Mary Rose Santos was 26 years old. A mother with a complicated past. She was the oldest of 4, raised in Freetown. Her family described her as warm and loving, a fantastic cook. That year, Santos had reconciled with her husband, Donald. The two were living together in the South End. She was on welfare, and he was on disability. They were trying to rebuild, but like so many others, Santos was caught in the underworld of addiction. The city had a gravity to it, and once you slip beneath the surface, it was hard to come back. On July 16, 1988, her husband dropped her off near a downtown bus station. She told him she planned to walk to her friend's apartment nearby. She never arrived. 5 hours later, witnesses saw her inside the old quarterdeck lounge. She was dancing, laughing. It would be the last time anyone saw her alive. Then, nothing. No calls, no sightings, no body. Months passed. On March 31st, 1989, 2 boys were walking down Route 88 in Westport when they saw something near the roadside. It was a body, nude, decomposed, lying just 25 feet from the shoulder. Nearby, an empty beer bottle. The remains had been there for months, picked apart by time, weather, and wildlife. It took weeks before investigators could confirm what they already suspected. In April 1989, they forensically identified the remains as Mary Santos. Investigators dug into her background and found unsettling links. Santos had once been represented by attorney Kenneth Ponte, who was already tied to Nancy Paiva and Rochelle Dopiarala. Strangely, Ponte helped her husband distribute missing persons flyers. And then there was the letter. 2 weeks before her body was found, the Bristol County District Attorney's Office received an anonymous letter. Chillingly, it hinted that a body was lying along Route 88. 2 weeks later, that's exactly where Mary was found. An informant came forward, claiming they had witnessed an event on that road the night Mary disappeared. Investigators met with this informant in secret at various locations to conceal their identity. However, these conversations never led to the identification of a suspect. No names, no charges, only a letter and a body, and the persistent sense that things were far from over. Sandra Botelho was 24 years old. She was a mother of two, trying and failing to stay afloat in a city that was swallowing people whole. By the summer of 1988, her life had unraveled. She had lived in New Bedford's North End. According to her boyfriend, Craig Andrade, she had turned to sex work to feed her heroin addiction. She was alone. Records indicate that she was close with Christina Montero, another victim who would later vanish. The two shared clothes and Johns, working the street together. Her family said that she had lived with an abusive man for nearly 10 years, but in the last months of her life, she was pursuing a GED. She wanted to get clean, but the streets wouldn't let her go. On the night of August 11th, 1988, Botelho left her apartment around 11 p.m. and she was never seen again. She was reported missing, but for months there were no leads, only silence. Then, in April 1989, the waiting ended. A state highway work crew clearing brush near Interstate 195 in Marion, just 20 miles from New Bedford, stumbled on human remains. Her body was undressed, curled into a fetal position, left just beyond the tree line where headlights couldn't reach. By then, police were already looking for a serial killer. Botelho's death confirmed it. And with her came a new name into the web of suspicion, Anthony DeGrazia. He was 26 years old, a stonemason with a reputation for violence against workers. In 1989, multiple women came forward with stories of surviving brutal assaults by DeGrazia. A grand jury witness claimed he had bragged about hurting women. Police suspected him, but they had nothing concrete. DeGrazia was eventually charged with unrelated assaults, but never with Botelho's murder. In 1991, while out on bail, he took his own life, taking with him any answers he might have had. Despite a grand jury investigation, FBI involvement, and years of speculation, no one was ever charged with Botelho's murder. She was just another woman in the woods, another body the highway tried to bury. Dawn Mendez was a daughter and a mother, and at just 25 years old, she was trapped in a desperate battle with addiction. She grew up in New Bedford's housing projects, raised alongside 9 siblings by a mother who did everything she could to hold the family together. Mendez earned her GED, enrolled in a secretarial program, and for a time, it seemed like she had a future. But then, she met a man. They lived together, off and on for years, sharing more than just a home. They shared drugs, and this is when her addiction really took root. At 17, she gave birth to a boy, whom she loved, even after losing custody. Her mother raised him, but Mendez stayed in his life. And then in April 1988, things got worse. Her mother saw her with a fractured arm, broken by the man she had spent years running back to. By June, she had moved back in with him, and by July, she was missing. It was Labor Day weekend, September 4th, 1988. Mendez was supposed to be at a christening, a family gathering, a rare moment of normalcy. She was last seen leaving her apartment, heading toward the celebration. She never arrived. 6 days later, her family reported her missing. By then, women were already vanishing from New Bedford. For months, there was no sign of her. Then, November 29, 1988, a Connecticut State Police cadaver dog combed through the brush off Interstate 195 in Dartmouth near the Reed Road exit. The dog uncovered a skeletal figure, discarded in the woods, badly decomposed. The skin was still intact on her hand, enough for investigators to lift a fingerprint. It was Mendez. She had been strangled and left nude, dumped in the trees. She was the 5th woman found that year, and by the time she was recovered, the investigation had shifted into overdrive. The police knew they were hunting a serial killer, someone who had access to Weld Square, someone who preyed on women trapped in addiction, in cycles of abuse, in places where no one noticed when they vanished. Reports emerged that Mendez had been seen at Kenneth Ponte's house before she disappeared, but there was no physical evidence, no forensic trail. Without any other leads, Mendez became another victim. A name turned into a number, and she wouldn't be the last. Christina Montero was just 19 years old when she disappeared. Petite, between 5'3" and 5'5", weighing barely 110 pounds. She bore the markings of a troubled life, needle marks on both arms, scars on her wrists and near one eye, and several tattoos inked onto her skin. Montero had been living on the margins for some time. She was a heroin addict and sex worker, and then sometime in the middle of 1988, she vanished. A few reports placed her in New Bedford that July, lingering on familiar corners, but no sighting was ever confirmed, no timeline ever solidified. At the time of her disappearance, she was last known to be wearing a shirt, blue jeans, and sneakers. Unlike the others, Montero's body was never recovered. Her story is defined by its void. She wasn't added to the list until much later, after investigators began connecting the dots, after it was clear that something was hunting women along the highways. By then, the trail had already gone cold. Montero fit the pattern perfectly. She was the youngest among the presumed victims, and like the others, her life intersected with the lives of other victims. She lived near Marilyn Roberts, another woman who would vanish without a trace. They were neighbors, shared sidewalks and social circles. Maybe they disappeared the same way. There is no crime scene, no evidence, just a name and an absence. Somewhere in the empty stretches of highway near New Bedford, back where the headlights don't reach, the truth still exists. But whether it will ever surface is a question that grows quieter every day, and silence is the one thing that always seems to return. Marilyn Roberts should have been safe. She wasn't a drifter. Her father was a retired New Bedford police officer, but none of that mattered, because in April 1988, she vanished. Like Christina Montero, her body was never found. Roberts was 34 years old with brown hair and eyes. Addiction had pulled her into a dangerous place, the same way it had so many others. Her family believed she was trying to start over. They thought she had gone west, that she had moved to California to be with relatives in early 1988. For months, they held on to that belief. They thought she had left, but she hadn't. Roberts was last heard from on April 1st, 1988. By June 1988, her father had filed a missing person report after discovering she had never traveled to California. Later that month, there was a sighting reported in New Bedford. Someone who knew her claimed they had seen her alive and well, but after that, she was never seen again. As the months passed, the truth became harder to ignore. By 1989, Roberts was officially considered one of 2 missing women connected to the New Bedford Highway Killer. She was one of the first victims, shortly followed by Montero. They were here, then they weren't, and to this day, no one knows where they went. Women had always disappeared from the streets of New Bedford. Some ran, some overdosed, some were swallowed by Weld Square. But between 1988 and 1989, the quiet coastal city became a hunting ground. The investigation into these murders would become one of the most extensive and expensive criminal investigations in Massachusetts history, and it began in the summer of 1988. On July 3rd, the body of Deborah Medeiros was found, partially decomposed, along Route 140. Responding officers could not have anticipated the hellscape that the investigation would become over the next year. Initially, they treated Medeiros' death as an isolated incident, but a pattern began to emerge when a second body was discovered. Detective John Dextrador was one of the first to voice his suspicion. He noticed a pattern as more bodies began to appear. He saw similarities among the victims, their backgrounds, their lifestyles, their final locations, all along the highway, near exits, in the forgotten spaces, just beyond the tree line. All of them women, all of them addicts. Dextrador was the first to recognize the pattern. This was something else. This was a serial killer. By September 1988, Dextrador took his concerns to the Bristol County District Attorney's Office, convincing higher authorities to establish a task force. This marked a critical turning point in the investigation, but valuable time had already been lost in the early months. As more bodies were discovered throughout late 1988 and early 1989, the size and complexity of the investigation expanded dramatically. Between November and December of '88, 4 more victims were found. Each discovery intensified the urgency of the investigation and heightened public fear. Every day for over 2 months, they scoured the isolated stretches of Route 140 and Interstate 195 with 1 or more cadaver dogs digging through the brush. These dogs were instrumental in discovering remains. The geographical pattern of body disposal showed that the killer was familiar with the roadways around New Bedford, choosing secluded but accessible locations along major highways where bodies could be quickly disposed of, but might remain undiscovered for some time. Tragically, the victims had been missing for months before their bodies were found, and decomposition had erased nearly all forensic evidence. This pattern made the determination of the cause of death, collection of forensic evidence, and victim identification extremely difficult. The physical positioning of victims along highways meant they were exposed to the elements, which further degraded potential evidence. The marginalization of the victims and delay in reporting worked against police. Their dangerous and transient lifestyles meant that their disappearances weren't always immediately reported, allowing the killer to operate undetected for longer periods of time. Many of the victims had spent their last days between living arrangements, their timelines unclear at best. Even when law enforcement turned to witnesses, they found little cooperation. Fear ruled New Bedford's underworld. Drug users and sex workers didn't trust the police, and those who might have known something were too afraid to speak. It wasn't a city where people talked, so investigators turned to the courts. District Attorney Frankie Pina convened a secret grand jury, an unusual move meant to pry information from the city's most reluctant voices. Dozens of witnesses, mostly sex workers and drug users, were subpoenaed and questioned about the men they feared, the men who had hurt them, the men they had last seen with the victims. This was how the names began to surface. Kenneth Ponte, Anthony DeGrazia. In 1990, the investigation finally seemed to break open. An arrest and indictment was made, and it looked like the case was finally closing. Tragically, it wouldn't be long until it fell apart. In the sprawling constellation of figures tied to the New Bedford Highway killings, one casts a longer, darker shadow than the rest. Kenneth C. Ponte, a local attorney, a former heroin addict, a man whose name threaded through the lives of multiple victims, and in 1990, he became the only person ever charged in connection with the case. At 40 years old, Ponte was a paradox. On paper, he was a practicing lawyer, a man entrusted with defending others in court. But behind closed doors, his life unraveled in ways disturbingly close to the clients he represented. Ponte had connections to many of the victims. He had dated Robin Rhodes, one of the first victims to disappear. He had represented Mary Rose Santos in a civil case, and eerily helped her husband distribute missing person flyers after she vanished. He had dated and housed Rochelle Dopiarala, allowing her to stay in his home shortly before she died. He had been seen repeatedly with Deborah Medeiros, and Dawn Mendez was once seen banging on the door to his home. In late 1988, after the first victims were found, Ponte abruptly moved to Port Richey, Florida. The neighborhood didn't welcome him. There were fights, shotgun blasts outside his house, and reports of drug activity and strange guests. Massachusetts investigators flew to Florida in 1989 to quietly observe him. They spoke with local police who had already received multiple tips about Ponte's connection to the killings. By the end of 1989, Ponte's Port Richey property had been searched under warrant. Officers scoured his home, shed, and a second duplex. Police recovered a blood-stained belt and sent it for forensic testing that would ultimately fail to link Ponte to the crimes. They also found something else, a story just believable enough to chase. A woman contacted investigators and claimed that a videotape showing a murder had once been buried in Ponte's Florida yard. She said it depicted a woman being strangled with a belt, her face locked in a dead stare. Police took it seriously. They flew back to Florida. They dug up Ponte's yard. They found nothing. Then the woman changed her story. The tape, she said, had been stolen by someone else, supposedly for blackmail. And the deeper they dug, the stranger it got. Back in 1984, years before the killings, Ponte had phoned New Bedford police in a panic, claiming that a VHS copy of Porky's had been altered. He said it showed violent crimes against women and infants, visible only when the film was played frame by frame. Detectives humored him. They watched the tape. It was just Porky's. But Ponte, wide-eyed and trembling, insisted the atrocities were real, that someone had inserted the images, that they were trying to send him a message. Investigators left, shaken, not by the tape, but by Ponte's state of mind. Later, witnesses would come forward claiming Ponte owned or viewed violent, possibly homemade pornography. One woman said she'd seen a tape in his home that showed a woman being strangled. Another said it looked too real to be staged. The word snuff film started floating around the investigation, but no such tape was ever found. No evidence ever tied Ponte to a murder scene. No charges ever stuck. Roger Swire came forward with his story of how Ponte accosted him with a weapon on behalf of Dopiarala, how she had vanished less than a month later. Prosecutors claimed Dopiarala had threatened to testify against Ponte, possibly to expose his drug use or criminal behavior. This would have given him motive and opportunity. Yet even in court, he never wavered. He denied everything. Despite the indictment, the case against Ponte was fragile. There was no physical evidence, no eyewitnesses to the crime, and no confession. In July 1991, the entire prosecution collapsed. The case dissolved and Ponte was released. He would return to Massachusetts, haunted by the case, his reputation in ashes, and he would eventually be disbarred for unrelated misconduct. He took a room in a low-rent motel. He walked the same streets where the victims were last seen. Some said he looked gaunt, haunted, like a man half erased. He lived like that for years, quiet, unwell, and untouchable. In 2007, investigators returned to his old New Bedford home. Acting on a tip, they dug up his backyard, searching for the remains of one of the missing women. They found nothing. In 2009, they returned again, this time tearing up a concrete driveway he had poured in 1988. Still nothing. In 2010, Ponte died of a reported overdose, alone in a small New Bedford apartment. No autopsy was conducted. No foul play was suspected. His death certificate listed it simply as acute intoxication. He was 60 years old. He had never confessed. He had never been convicted. And with his death, a chapter closed. But the shadow cast over the victims and the city itself never left, not entirely, because if he wasn't the New Bedford Highway Killer, then who was? Before the bodies started turning up, the women already knew his name. They knew it from whispers, from bruises, from close calls on quiet streets. By the time the first victims were found along the highways, some already believed they knew who did it. They just couldn't prove it. His name was Anthony DeGrazia, and he didn't hide in the dark. He was a stonemason in his late 20s. He was young, muscular, and volatile. A man with a growing rap sheet and dangerous reputation. His record already included arrests for trespassing, resisting arrest, assault, and threats. He had previously been charged with multiple sex crimes, but he was acquitted after his girlfriend testified he was with her the night 2 teenage girls claimed he assaulted them in the Freetown State Forest. His truck matched descriptions from multiple survivors, and he was known to frequent the Weld Square area, where many of the victims were last seen. Witnesses said he had a boxer's nose, pushed in and unmistakable. Survivors of his attacks often remembered that detail before anything else. Between 1988 and 1989, DeGrazia was charged with 4 counts of sex crimes and even more charges of assault and battery. His alleged victims were women involved in sex work, and their accounts were terrifyingly consistent. One woman testified that DeGrazia put her in a headlock and tried to snap her neck, growling and twisting until she could no longer lift her arms. Another said he dragged her into a cemetery, choked her until she blacked out and left her there. A third said he warned her, "You don't want to end up like the others." DeGrazia's vehicle was identified in at least one case when police recovered a door handle matching his 1990 Ford pickup from the scene of an attempted attack. One woman said he confessed that he told her in detail what it was like to watch someone go still, that he liked it, that it made him feel something. Police considered DeGrazia a strong person of interest in the highway killings. He had no verifiable alibi for the time several victims disappeared. Some women said they'd seen victims like Dawn Mendez getting into his truck. In April 1989, he was brought in for questioning. He denied everything, but he was scared. He called his priest, convinced someone was going to pin the murders on him. Even as a grand jury heard testimony from survivors implicating him, the physical evidence never connected him to the murders. DNA and hair evidence recovered from the victims did not match DeGrazia. In 1991, while awaiting trial on unrelated charges, DeGrazia died by suicide. He left no note, no explanation, and no confession. He was never charged with any of the New Bedford Highway murders. Over the years, a small gallery of shadows gathered at the edge of the investigation. One of the more serious contenders was Daniel Tavares Jr., who murdered his mother in 1991. While in prison, he sent a letter to corrections staff, a threat laced with something colder. He implied that he had been involved in the highway killings, but his confession never went further. Today, he's serving a life sentence in Washington state, linked to multiple unrelated killings, but whether he was involved in New Bedford remains an open question. A handful of unnamed suspects were floated in relation to the murders. A Missouri man who claimed credit for the murders and then recanted, an attacker in Rhode Island who made the same claim. Theories emerged, desperate to find a pattern to the brutal killings. Some suggested a transient fisherman due to the seasonality of the crimes. Others suggested the Connecticut River Valley Killer due to similarities in method and motive. The more names they gathered, the more the outlines blurred. Some were violent, some were clever, some were simply there, breathing the same air as the women who vanished. But at night, in the brush along the highway, they were all the same shape. Men with rage in their hands and silence in their mouths. The kind of silence that lets you drive home like nothing ever happened. And maybe the unsettling truth was that the city had more than just a killer. It had a pattern, with plenty of men willing to step into it. The highways around New Bedford are quiet now. The brush has been cleared. The suspects are dead. The headlines have changed hands and faded from memory. But the silence remains. It clings to the edges of the road like dew frost, thin and fragile, waiting to crack. Headlights sweep across the shoulder. Tires hum softly over asphalt. Time has done its job. The new Bedford Highway Killer was never caught because he was never meant to be. He hunted where there were no alarms, only the hush of passing traffic. We have built the circumstances for tragedy, and we turn a blind eye when it comes. Maybe it was never just one man. Maybe it was never that simple. Maybe it is only ever a pattern, a recurring distortion, a shape in the dark that waits for our permission to begin hunting. It traveled the highways and rustled the tree line. It discarded bodies like broken reflections, and it vanished just long enough for most to forget it was ever really there. But the truth is, it will never leave. The empty shoulder, the mile marker, the flicker in the trees. We know it's more than memory. It's something trying to come back. Monsters don't disappear, even in death. Instead, they change shape, take new forms. They wait, coiled and patient, ready to fix a different face, ready to wear another name. When it does, we will do what we always do. We will hope there is someone unwilling to be forgotten and unwilling to forget.